"Marry my dad," the little boy whispered, his eyes wide and serious. "Please, Miss Zuri. He's lonely, and I need a mommy." Zuri was crouched behind a stack of industrial-sized flour bags in the kitchen of a dimly lit Seoul diner, her heart hammering against her ribs as she hid from the debt collectors banging on the front glass. She looked at the 5-year-old boy who had just crawled into her hiding spot and let out a shaky, breathless laugh. "If I marry him," she whispered back, ruffling his dark hair to mask her trembling hands, "will he protect me from the monsters outside?" The boy nodded solemnly. "My daddy is the biggest monster of all. No one scares him." Zuri smiled, thinking it was just a child's game in a moment of terror. She whispered, "Then it's a deal." She had no way of knowing that this playful promise, made in the dark, would hand her life over to Shin Jae-won, the legendary dragon of the Korean underworld and the most feared mafia boss in the country. Before we find out what happens when the dragon comes to collect his son's new bride, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us bring these incredible stories to life. Now, let's get back to Zuri's story. Zuri had moved to Seoul for a fresh start, but reality had been a cold wake-up call. Between an expiring visa and a boss who refused to pay her the 800,000 won he owed, she was living on the edge of survival. Like every other Tuesday, the shadows outside the diner weren't just shadows, they were the men her ex-landlord had sent to collect a debt she didn't even owe. She had been bracing for a beating or worse when little Seo-jun appeared out of nowhere. He didn't look like he belonged in a grease-stained diner, his coat cost more than Zuri made in a year. But it wasn't his clothes that stopped her breath, it was the 30 black-suited men who suddenly materialized outside, bowing so low their foreheads nearly touched the pavement as a single black sedan pulled up to the curb. Zuri realized then that the monsters she was hiding from weren't the ones she should be afraid of. The real danger had just stepped out of the car, adjusting his cufflinks, with a dragon tattoo creeping up his neck. The diner was silent, save for the rhythmic humming of a flickering neon sign and the frantic thud of Zuri's pulse. She stayed low behind the counter, her fingers still resting in Seo-jun's soft hair. The boy didn't flinch at the chaos outside, he simply watched her with an eerie, calm intelligence that felt far beyond his 5 years. "You have kind eyes," Seo-jun noted, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of Zuri's panic. "And you smell like vanilla and hard work. My daddy likes people who work hard. He says the world is full of lazy ghosts." Zuri forced a smile, though her eyes darted toward the front windows. The debt collectors who had been screaming and pounding on the glass only moments ago had gone deathly quiet. "Your daddy sounds like a very serious man, Seo-jun. But shouldn't you be with him? It's dangerous out there." "I was testing you," the boy replied, tilting his head. "I had to see if you would hide me or push me away to save yourself. You hid me. That means you're qualified." Before Zuri could ask what on earth a kindergartner meant by qualified, the diner's heavy glass door swung open. The chime didn't just ring, it felt like a warning bell. A cold draft swept through the narrow aisles, carrying the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain. A man stepped into the light. He was tall, dressed in a black suit so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. His presence didn't just fill the room, it claimed it. As he moved, the collar of his dress shirt shifted, revealing the tail of a dark, ink-black dragon coiling up his throat. Behind him, 2 lines of men in identical suits stood like statues at the entrance, their gazes fixed firmly on the floor. Zuri felt the air vanish from her lungs. This wasn't the landlord's hired muscle. This was something primeval. Shin Jae-won scanned the room with eyes as hard as obsidian. When his gaze landed on the corner where Zuri crouched with his son, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't yell. He didn't rush. He simply walked toward them, each footfall echoing with the weight of an approaching storm. "Seo-jun," the man said, his voice a low, melodic growl. "I told you to wait in the car." The little boy stood up, brushing the flour dust from his knees, and pointed a small finger at Zuri. "I found her, Appa. The one I told you about. She agreed to the deal. She's going to marry us." Jae-won stopped. He looked down at Zuri, his expression unreadable, observant, and terrifyingly intense. He looked at her tattered apron, her trembling hands, and finally, the defiant spark in her dark eyes that she couldn't quite suppress. "Is that so?" Jae-won murmured, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "I hope you realize, Miss Zuri, that in my world, we don't make deals we aren't prepared to keep." The silence in the diner was so heavy it felt physical, broken only by the muffled sound of a distant siren. Jae-won reached out, his gloved hand moving with a predator's grace as he lifted Seo-jun into his arms. The transition was seamless, the boy's small, trusting frame against the man's rigid, black-clad shoulder. It was a picture of absolute protection, but Zuri only saw the danger. "My son doesn't make mistakes," Jae-won said, his dark eyes never leaving Zuri's face. "But he is a child. He thinks in fairy tales. I, however, think in assets and liabilities." He gestured toward the door, and one of the silent men stepped forward, placing a sleek, charcoal-gray folder on the grease-stained table. The contrast was jarring, the high-quality vellum paper resting next to a spilled packet of sugar. "Your name is Zuri. Your visa expires in 12 days. You owe 4 million won in back rent, and your family in America has been calling you from 3 different block numbers this week, begging for money you don't have." Jae-won leaned in, the dragon tattoo on his neck shifting as he spoke. "You are a woman drowning in a city that doesn't care if you sink." Zuri swallowed hard, her pride stinging more than her fear. "How do you know all that?" "In Seoul, I am the water," he replied simply. "I know everything that moves within it." He tapped the folder. "This is the contract Seo-jun thinks is a wedding invitation. You will move into my estate. You will be his mother, his shadow, and his shield for exactly 6 months. In exchange, your debts will vanish. Your visa will be upgraded to permanent residency. And when the 6 months are over, you will receive a settlement that ensures you never have to serve a cup of coffee again." Zuri looked at the folder, then at Seo-jun, who was watching her with an expression of pure, heartbreaking hope. "Why me?" she whispered. "You could buy 100 nannies. You could marry a princess." Jae-won's eyes flickered with something cold and sharp. "Nannies can be bribed. Princesses have agendas. My son saw something in you that he hasn't seen in anyone since his mother died, a person who hides a stranger instead of herself. I need that courage. My world is about to become very violent, Zuri. I need a mother for my son who isn't afraid of the dark." He stood up, the deal hanging in the air like a blade. "Sign it, and the men outside your door disappear tonight. Refuse, and you go back to hiding behind flour bags." Zuri looked at her trembling hands, then at the man who looked like he could crush her with a word. She reached for the pen. The black sedan glided through the iron gates of the Shin estate as if it were entering a different century. High stone walls, topped with discreetly placed cameras and jagged glass, gave way to a sprawling sanctuary of manicured gardens and traditional Hanok architecture fused with cold, modern glass. As the car came to a halt, a dozen men in dark suits appeared, their movements synchronized and silent. Zuri stepped out, her sneakers looking painfully out of place on the polished white gravel. She felt Seo-jun's small, warm hand slip into hers, a silent anchor in a world that felt designed to make her feel small. The interior of the main house smelled of aged cedar and power. Jae-won walked ahead, his footsteps echoing with an authority that didn't need to be shouted. He led them into a vast, sunken hall where the air was thick with the scent of bitter tea and incense. Seated on low silk cushions were 3 men, their faces etched with the deep lines of a life spent in the shadows. These were the elders, the keepers of the syndicate's bloodline and tradition. Their eyes, sharp and predatory, raked over Zuri with a coldness that made her skin crawl. "You bring a stranger into the inner sanctum, Jae-won?" the oldest man asked, his voice like dry parchment. He didn't look at Zuri, he spoke as if she were a piece of furniture moved into the wrong room. "A girl from across the ocean to play at being a mother to the heir of the Shin line." Jae-won didn't sit. He stood behind Zuri and Seo-jun, his presence a towering wall of black silk and controlled fury. She is not a stranger, Jae-won replied, his voice dropping into that dangerous, melodic growl. She is the woman my son chose. And in this house, my son's instinct is law. The elder narrowed his eyes, his gaze finally landing on Zuri. She has no pedigree. No standing. She is a waitress with nothing to her name. Zuri felt the sting of the insult, but she didn't look away. She remembered the debt collectors, the flour bags, and the years she had spent surviving on nothing but her own will. She squeezed Seo-jun's hand and stepped forward, breaking the rigid protocol of the room. I have a name, she said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. And I have the one thing you clearly don't, the trust of that little boy. The room went deathly still. The elders bristled, shocked by the audacity of a woman who dared to speak without permission. Jae-won's hand settled briefly on the small of Zuri's back, a touch so fleeting she almost missed it, but the message was clear. He wasn't just bringing her into his house, he was arming her for the war to come. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's private gallery, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished obsidian floor. Zuri stood in the center of the room, feeling exposed in the silence. Gone was her stained waitress uniform, replaced by a tailored dress of deep emerald silk that felt like a second skin. Jae-won paced around her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. He didn't look at her with the warmth of a husband, but with the cold, analytical eye of a craftsman. In this world, Zuri, people do not listen to what you say. They listen to the way you stand, he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the faint, spicy scent of his cologne. You are still carrying the weight of that diner on your shoulders. Drop them. Zuri stiffened, her chin lifting defiantly. It's hard to forget the weight of the real world when I'm living in a gilded cage. Jae-won's eyes darkened, a flicker of something, amusement or perhaps respect, crossing his features. He reached out, his leather-gloved fingers brushing the underside of her jaw, forcing her to look him in the eye. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a simmering tension that had nothing to do with the contract they had signed. The cage is only gilded if you let it be, he murmured. If you walk into a room and look for an exit, they will hunt you. If you walk into a room and act as if you own the air everyone else is breathing, they will fear you. He moved behind her, his hands settling on her waist to adjust her posture. His touch was firm, possessive, and unexpectedly grounded. Power isn't about the gun in your hand, Zuri. It's about the certainty in your spine. You aren't just a girl from across the ocean anymore. You are the woman beside the dragon. When you look at the elders, do not look for their approval. Look for their weakness. Zuri took a breath, feeling the heat of his body behind her. She squared her shoulders, mimicking his effortless, dangerous poise. She saw their reflection in the glass, the towering, lethal shadow of the Mafia boss and the vibrant, resilient woman standing before him. For a moment, the air between them thickened, the fake nature of their arrangement feeling increasingly fragile. Better, he whispered against her ear, his breath hitching just slightly. Now, walk. And don't look back. The gardens of the Shin estate were a masterpiece of serenity, filled with the gentle weeping of willow trees and the soft babble of stone fountains. But as Zuri followed the sound of a muffled sob, she realized that even in this paradise, the shadows were long. She found Seo-jun tucked away in a hidden alcove of ancient stone, his small body curled into a tight ball beneath a flowering cherry tree. He wasn't playing, he was trembling, his hands pressed hard over his ears. Seo-jun. Zuri whispered, kneeling on the mossy ground. She didn't reach for him immediately, sensing the fragile barrier he had built around himself. The boy looked up, his face pale and streaked with tears. The red light, he whimpered, his voice barely audible. It's back, Miss Zuri. On the wall. Zuri looked at the stone behind him. There was no light, only the dappled shadow of leaves. She moved closer, her heart aching as she realized he wasn't seeing the garden, he was seeing a memory. Tell me about the light, sweetie. Seo-jun's breath hitched. It was on Mommy's dress. A little red dot. Right here. He pointed to the center of his chest. She was laughing, and then the glass broke. There was so much noise, and she told me to hide under the table. She didn't come under with me. She just stayed on the floor. The air left Zuri's lungs. She finally understood why Jaewon was so protective, why the estate was a fortress, and why Seo-jun carried the gravity of an old man. This child hadn't just lost a mother, he had witnessed the cold, calculated violence of his father's world. He was a survivor of a hit meant for the dragon's heart. Look at me, Seo-jun, Zuri said, her voice dropping into a low, rhythmic hum, the same one she used to calm herself during the darkest nights in the diner. She reached out and gently took his hands away from his ears, folding them into hers. The red light isn't here. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. You promise? He asked, his eyes searching hers for the slightest hint of a lie. The bad men, they want to take the people I love. Then they'll have to go through me, Zuri said with a fierce certainty that surprised even her. She pulled him into her lap, wrapping her emerald silk skirts around him like a shield. From the balcony above, hidden by the silk curtains, Shin Jae-won watched them. He saw the way his son finally let go of his breath, burying his face in Zuri's neck. He saw the way Zuri held the boy, not with the practiced duty of a nanny, but with the raw, protective instinct of a mother who had decided to fight. For the first time in years, the dragon felt a crack in his own armor. He had hired a waitress to play a part, but he was starting to realize he had brought home a savior. The dining room was a cathedral of cold marble and sharp edges, lit by a chandelier that dripped with crystal like frozen tears. Zuri sat at the long mahogany table, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, exactly as Jaewon had taught her. Across from her sat Shin Jae-ho, Jaewon's younger brother. Unlike Jaewon's disciplined, quiet power, Jae-ho wore his malice like a cheap cologne, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that didn't reach his restless eyes. It's a curious thing, isn't it? Jae-ho began, swirling a glass of deep red wine. He didn't look at Zuri, but at the elders seated further down the table. In our lineage, we value purity. We value legacy. And yet, my brother brings home a girl who likely smelled of burnt coffee and grease 48 hours ago. Zuri felt the blood rush to her face, but she didn't drop her gaze. Beside her, she felt the atmosphere shift. Jaewon hadn't moved a muscle, yet the air around him seemed to hum with a lethal frequency. Tell me, dear, Jae-ho continued, finally fixing his sneer on Zuri. What is the going rate for a waitress to play a mother? Or did you just see the Shin name and decide it was easier than begging for tips on a Seoul sidewalk? A woman like you, you're nothing but a temporary stain on a very expensive suit. The insult was sharp, designed to humiliate her in front of the syndicate's highest members. Zuri opened her mouth to speak, but she didn't get the chance. The sound of the chair hitting the floor was like a gunshot. In a blur of black silk, Jae-won was across the table. He didn't use a weapon, his hand shot out, seizing Jae-ho by the throat and slamming his head back against the high-backed chair with a sickening thud. The wine glass shattered against the floor, splattering red like a fresh wound. Jae-won, stop, one of the elders barked, but the dragon didn't listen. Jae-won leaned in, his face inches from his brother's. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe in the candlelight. His voice was a whisper, but it carried more terror than a scream. You will never speak to her again. You will not look at her. You will not breathe the same air in this room unless you are on your knees. His grip tightened, Jae-ho's face turning a desperate shade of purple as his feet kicked uselessly under the table. She is the future of this house. You are a debt I am tired of paying. Give me one more reason, brother, and I will bury you in the garden we played in as children. Jae-won let go, and Jae-ho collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Jae-won didn't look back at him. He turned to Zuri, his eyes still burning with a dark, terrifying fire, but his hand was steady as he reached out for hers. We are leaving, he said. The ancestral hall was a sea of white silk and the heavy, earthy scent of burning pine. It was the day of the Jessa, a ceremony of remembrance that required precision, silence, and a deep understanding of a heritage Zuri was only beginning to grasp. As she stood at the threshold, dressed in a muted, elegant hanbok that complemented her deep complexion, she felt the weight of 1,000 years of tradition pressing against her. The syndicate's wives and the high-ranking staff watched from the periphery, their faces masks of polite skepticism. They expected her to fail, to stumble over the complex rites, or to show the crude manners they assumed a foreigner would possess. Jae-won stood at the head of the altar, his face a stony mask of duty, but his eyes followed Zuri's every move. The tension was thick enough to choke the flickering candles. As the ceremony began, Zuri stepped forward to assist with the ritual offerings. She moved with the poise Jae-won had taught her, but there was something more, a visible, quiet reverence in her eyes that wasn't rehearsed. When she knelt to arrange the fruit and rice, her movements were slow and deliberate, honoring the gravity of the moment rather than just the steps of the ritual. The turning point came not with the elders, but with the household staff. Mrs. Han, the head housekeeper who had served the Shin family for 40 years and whose approval was more difficult to win than any gang leaders, fumbled with a heavy ceremonial vessel. The bronze jar began to tilt, threatening to spill its contents across the pristine floor, a disaster that would be seen as a curse upon the house. Before anyone else could react, Zuri was there. She didn't worry about the staining of her expensive silk or the breach of protocol. She reached out, her steady hands catching the jar and stabilizing Mrs. Han with a gentle touch on her arm. Instead of looking to the elders for credit, Zuri looked directly at the elderly housekeeper and offered a small, private smile of reassurance. "I've got it," she whispered in Korean, the phrase practiced and soft. In that moment, the icy atmosphere in the back of the hall began to thaw. The staff, who had spent their lives being treated as invisible by the pure Shin bloodline, saw a woman who saw them. They saw a queen who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty to save another's dignity. As the incense smoke curled toward the ceiling, the whispers changed. The skepticism didn't vanish, but it shifted into a grudging, quiet respect. Jae-won watched as Zuri returned to his side, her head held high. She hadn't just navigated their culture, she had brought her own heart into it. For the first time, she wasn't just a contract holder in the eyes of the house, she was becoming the pulse of the home. The black sedan didn't pull into a gated club or a private high-rise. Instead, it glided to a stop near the edge of a bustling street market, where the air was thick with the scent of charred meat, sweet cinnamon, and the vibrant hum of ordinary life. Jae-won stepped out, shedding his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves, revealing the full, intricate length of the dragon ink on his forearms. For a moment, he didn't look like a man who commanded a criminal empire, he looked like a man who simply wanted to breathe. Zuri followed him into the neon-lit maze of stalls, her heart lightening as she took in the familiar chaos of the vendors and the steam rising from bubbling vats of tteokbokki. They walked in a comfortable silence, the bodyguards trailing at a distance that allowed them to feel almost alone. Jae-won stopped at a humble stand, handing Zuri a skewer of spicy fish cakes. "You look more at home here than in the mansion," he noted, his voice losing its serrated edge. "I am at home here," Zuri admitted, leaning against a wooden pillar. "In the diner, everyone was equal. Nobody cared about your bloodline, they just cared if the coffee was hot and the smile was real. In your house, I feel like I'm constantly being measured by a ruler that doesn't have my numbers on it." Jae-won looked away, his gaze fixed on a young couple laughing nearby. "I was raised to believe that feeling was a weakness. My father told me that a man in my position is either a mountain or a grave. There is no middle ground." He turned back to her, his obsidian eyes softening. "But when I see you with Seo-jun, or when you helped Mrs. Han today, I wonder if I've spent my whole life building a fortress that's actually just a very expensive prison." Zuri took a step closer, the neon lights reflecting in the warmth of her eyes. "Why did you really bring me here, Jae-won? It wasn't just for the food." He reached out, his hand hesitating before his fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. The touch was different this time, not the firm correction of a teacher, but the tentative reaching of a man who had forgotten how to ask for something he wanted. "I wanted to see the woman who exists outside of my contract," he whispered. The one who made a deal with a little boy in a dark kitchen. I realized I don't want you to just play the part, Zuri. I want to know why you stayed. I stayed for the boy, she said softly, though the way her pulse jumped told a different story. But I think I'm staying for the man who is brave enough to show me this version of himself. The fake world they had built together felt miles away, replaced by the honest heat of the market and the realization that the dragon's heart was far more fragile than he ever let the world see. The transition from the warmth of the market to the cold reality of the underworld happened in a heartbeat. One moment, Zuri was laughing at a vendor's joke, the next, Jaewon's hand was a vice around her arm, pulling her toward the sedan. The air had changed. The casual strollers had been replaced by 3 silver SUVs weaving aggressively through the late-night traffic, their headlights flashing like predatory eyes. Get in. Low, Jaewon commanded, his voice returning to that terrifying, crystalline calm. Zuri scrambled into the reinforced back seat, where Seo-jun was already waiting, his face pale as he clutched his seatbelt. As the sedan roared to life, tires screaming against the asphalt, the first shatter of glass echoed through the cabin. A bullet had grazed the reinforced window, spiderwebbing the surface but failing to penetrate. Seo-jun let out a small, choked gasp, his eyes darting toward the window with a look of recognition that broke Zuri's heart. He was back in the memory of the red light. Seo-jun, look at me. Zuri cried, diving across the seat to shield him with her body. She grabbed his tablet from the seat pocket and turned on a bright, loud cartoon, shoving it into his hands. We're playing the game, remember? The fast and loud game. We have to see who can stay the quietest while the car goes fast. If you win, we get ice cream for breakfast. She began to hum the same low, rhythmic melody from the garden, her voice a forced anchor against the violent swaying of the car. Behind her, the world was ending. Jaewon had lowered the partition. He was a shadow of lethal motion, leaning out of the side window with a suppressed submachine gun. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of his return fire punctuated the screeching of brakes. Don't look out the window, Seo-jun, focus on the screen. Is the bear winning? Zuri chatted incessantly, her voice trembling but never breaking. She used her body to wedge the boy into the corner of the seat, absorbing the shocks of the high-speed turns. Every time a tire blew or metal scraped metal, she laughed, a bright, artificial sound that masked her absolute terror. Wow! Daddy is winning the race. He's so fast, right? Jaewon glanced back through the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Zuri's for a split second. He saw her, hair disheveled, back pressed against a door that was being peppered with lead, desperately spinning a fairy tale for his son. In that moment of adrenaline and gunpowder, he realized she wasn't just a mother figure, she was a soldier. With a final, violent jerk of the steering wheel, Jaewon sent the lead SUV spiraling into a construction barrier. The sedan surged forward, disappearing into the labyrinth of Seoul's underground tunnels. The silence that followed was deafening. I won, Seo-jun whispered, looking up from the tablet with wide, shimmering eyes. I was quiet, Miss Zuri. Zuri pulled him close, her hands shaking so violently she had to hide them in her skirts. You did, baby. You're the champion. Jaewon pulled the car to a stop in a safe house garage. He stepped out, his knuckles white as he opened the rear door. He didn't look at his son first. He looked at Zuri, the fake bride who had just held his world together with a nursery rhyme and a lie. The safe house was a minimalist cavern of concrete and steel, hidden beneath a nondescript warehouse. The adrenaline that had sustained Zuri through the chase ebbed away, leaving her limbs heavy and her nerves frayed. Seo-jun had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep in the adjacent room, cradling his tablet like a shield. In the main area, the only sound was the hum of the ventilation and the clatter of a first aid kit being set on a metal table. Jaewon sat on the edge of a bench, his shirt discarded. A jagged graze from a shattered glass shard tracked across his shoulder, weeping crimson against his pale skin and the dark ink of the dragon. He looked less like a king and more like a fallen soldier, his breathing heavy and his head bowed. Sit still, Zuri murmured, her voice thick with the remnants of her fear. She knelt beside him, her hands finally steadying as she soaked a cloth in antiseptic. As she pressed the cloth to the wound, Jae-won flinched, his muscles tensing beneath her touch. "I should have known they would move tonight," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I put you in the line of fire. I broke the first rule of the contract, your safety." "The contract didn't say anything about the car being shot at," Zuri replied, her focus entirely on the wound. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to patching herself up after long shifts and hard knocks. "But it also didn't say I'd be good at ice cream for breakfast, lies. We're even." She began to apply a bandage, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of his back. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. The air between them, once filled with the smell of gunpowder, was now heavy with a sudden, undeniable heat. Zuri found herself tracing the edge of the dragon tattoo, her touch lingering longer than necessary. Jae-won reached back, his hand catching hers. He didn't pull her away, he simply held her fingers against his skin. He turned slightly, his face inches from hers. The hardness in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that made Zuri's breath hitch. "You didn't scream," he whispered, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "Any other woman would have screamed. Why didn't you?" "Because Seo-jun was watching," she said, her voice barely a breath. "And because I knew you were in the front seat." The fake wedding ring on her finger caught the harsh overhead light, but the way Jae-won was looking at her had nothing to do with a legal document or a 6-month deal. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the dragon and the waitress were just two people seeking shelter in the wreckage of a violent life. The lines had blurred so completely that Zuri no longer knew where the act ended and the truth began. The safe house was still echoing with the quiet intimacy of the night before when the summons arrived. By noon, Zuri stood once again in the ancestral hall, but the atmosphere had shifted from skepticism to open hostility. The three elders sat like stone judges, their faces cast in shadow. Beside them stood a woman Zuri didn't recognize, Park Min-hee, the daughter of a rival syndicate leader, dressed in a hanbok of blinding white and gold. She was the picture of aristocratic perfection, a strategic bridge between two warring empires. "The ambush last night was a symptom of your weakness," Jae-won, the head elder declared, his voice cutting through the incense smoke. "The family is fractured because you have placed a commoner at the head of your table. Stability requires a blood alliance. You will marry Min-hee by the end of the month. The girl from America will be compensated and sent home." Zuri felt a cold hollow open in her chest. She looked at Jae-won, expecting the cold, calculating businessman to return. This was the logical move, the move that saved lives and consolidated power. She was just a waitress with a temporary contract, Min-hee was a kingdom. Jae-won didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, his hand coming to rest on the hilt of the ceremonial blade at his belt. His gaze didn't flicker toward the elders or the woman they had chosen for him. Instead, he reached back and took Zuri's hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a grip that was as much a promise as it was a tether. "You speak of stability," Jae-won said, his voice a low, resonant bell that commanded the room. "But you forget that a mountain is only stable because of its base. This woman protected my son while bullets tore through my car. She won the respect of my household while you sat in the dark and plotted. She is not a commoner. She is the heart of the Shin line." He stepped forward, pulling Zuri with him until they stood at the very edge of the elders' dais. "I am the dragon of this family. I do not take orders on who to love or who to trust. If you want a blood alliance, find another way. But as of this moment, the contract is over." A gasp rippled through the gathered witnesses. Zuri's heart leaped, was he sending her away? "The contract is over," Jae-won repeated, turning to Zuri with an intensity that burned. "Because I am no longer asking you to stay for 6 months. I am telling the world that you are my wife. Not by signature, but by choice. Anyone who challenges her position challenges me." The hall went deathly silent as Jae-won turned his back on the elders, leading Zuri toward the door. He had just declared war on his own tradition, choosing a waitress over an empire. As they stepped into the light, Zuri realized the target on her back had just grown 1,000 times larger, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to carry it. The afternoon sun was deceptive, casting a golden glow over the estate that suggested a peace which no longer existed. Zuri had only stepped away for a moment to retrieve Seo-jun's favorite book from the library, leaving him in the high-security playroom guarded by two of Jae-won's best men. But when she returned, the heavy oak door was ajar, the silence inside more deafening than any explosion. One guard lay slumped against the wall, unconscious, the other was gone. The window, supposedly made of unbreakable glass, had been precision cut, and the only thing left on the plush carpet was Seo-jun's tablet, its screen cracked and dark. A cold, visceral terror gripped Zuri, the kind that doesn't make you scream but turns your blood into ice. She didn't wait for the alarms. She didn't wait for Jae-won. She sprinted to the security monitors in the hallway, her fingers flying over the keys with a frantic dexterity born of desperation. She saw it on the peripheral gate camera, a black van speeding away, and for a split second, a face in the passenger seat. It was Shin Jae-ho, his mouth twisted into a triumphant, jagged sneer. Jae-won, she roared, her voice echoing through the marble halls until it reached him. By the time he arrived, the dragon was a vision of unleashed fury, but Zuri was ahead of him. She was already at the weapon locker, her eyes wild and focused. She wasn't the trembling waitress from the diner anymore, she was a mother whose cub had been snatched from the den. He has him, she rasped, pointing at the screen. Jae-ho didn't just take him for leverage. He took him to hurt you. He thinks because I'm a commoner, I'll be the weak link. He thinks I'll fold. Jae-won grabbed her shoulders, his grip bruising. Zuri, stay here. My men will handle this. It's too dangerous. Zuri ripped herself away, her gaze burning into his with a ferocity that made him recoil. He is my son now, Jae-won. You told the elders I was the heart of this house. Well, the heart doesn't stay behind when the soul is being stolen. She grabbed a tactical jacket, her movements sharp and lethal. I know how men like Jae-ho think. They overlook people like me. They think I'm just a waitress. That's why I'm the one who's going to get close enough to kill him if he touches a hair on that boy's head. In that moment, the fake contract was a ghost of the past. Zuri realized she would burn the entire city of Seoul to the ground to bring Seo-jun home. She looked at Jae-won, and for the first time, they weren't boss and employee, or even husband and wife. They were two predators, united by a singular, violent purpose. Tell the drivers to move, she commanded. We're going to get our son. The command center was a frantic blur of blue light and radio static, but Zuri stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on the grainy surveillance footage of the black van. While Jae-won's elite hackers scanned license plates and facial recognition databases, Zuri was looking at something else. She was looking at the details most men in this room considered beneath them, the same small, mundane details that had allowed her to survive years of service in the busiest corners of Seoul. Stop the tape, Zuri commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. The technician glanced at Jae-won, who gave a sharp nod. The image froze. Zuri stepped closer to the screen, pointing to a small, neon yellow sticker on the van's rear bumper and a peculiar dusting of white powder on the tires. That's not just mud, she said, her mind racing back to the conversations she'd overheard from construction workers at the diner. That's industrial lime, the kind used in high-grade concrete pouring. And that sticker? It's a permit for the Incheon dockyards, but specifically for the cold storage sector. My regulars used to complain about the smell of the ammonia there every morning. Jae-won moved to her side, his gaze narrowing as he processed her words. The Incheon docks are massive, Zuri. There are hundreds of warehouses. But only one that's currently under renovation near the fish markets, she countered, her finger tracing the dusting on the tires. Look at the pattern. It's fresh. Jae-ho isn't taking him to a luxury penthouse or a mountain hideout. He's taking him somewhere loud, cold, and busy, somewhere a child's cry would be drowned out by the sound of industrial fans and saltwater spray. He's hiding in plain sight, just like I used to. She turned to Jae-won, her eyes bright with a cold, analytical fire. He thinks you're looking for a high-level safe house. He thinks you'll check the borders and the luxury villas. He's forgotten that I know the alleyways of this city better than I know your mansion. He's at the old wharf, Warehouse 7. I saw the same lime on a delivery truck there last week. Jae-won stared at her, a profound sense of awe momentarily softening his lethal edge. He had spent a fortune on technology and soldiers, but it was the waitress, the woman who had spent a lifetime observing the world from the sidelines, who had found the needle in the haystack. Gear up, Jae-won ordered his men, his voice a low, terrifying promise of the violence to come. He turned to Zuri, his hand settling on the back of her neck in a gesture of absolute alignment. You've given us the location. Now, we bring him home. The Incheon dockyards were a labyrinth of rusted steel and screaming wind, the air thick with the briny scent of the sea and industrial chemicals. Warehouse 7 loomed ahead, a hulking shadow illuminated only by the rhythmic flash of the lighthouse. Jae-won moved like a phantom through the dark, his restraint finally shattered. As the heavy steel doors were breached, he became the dragon the legend spoke of, a whirlwind of lethal precision and cold, calculated violence. He didn't use words, he used the environment, moving through Jaeho's mercenaries with a terrifying grace that left no man standing. The sound of gunfire was swallowed by the roar of the industrial fans, but Jae-won's focus was singular, the small, trembling silhouette held at gunpoint in the center of the floor. While Jae-won drew the fire of the main guard, Zuri slipped through the side catwalks, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached the glass-walled office overlooking the floor, only to find that missing guard, the one who was supposed to be Seo-jun's protector, holding a detonator. He wasn't unconscious at the estate, he was the one who had opened the gates. Move another step, and the whole floor goes up, the traitor hissed, his hand shaking as he leveled a pistol at her. Jae-ho promised me more than a life of serving a child. Zuri didn't flinch. She stood her ground, the emerald silk of her dress stained with grease and salt, her silhouette tall against the flickering industrial lights. She looked at the man she had shared tea with only days ago. You think Jae-ho keeps promises? She asked, her voice steady and chillingly calm. In the diner, I saw men like you every day. Small men who think betrayal is a shortcut to being big. But you forgot one thing. She took a step forward, the barrel of his gun pressing into her chest. She saw the flash of hesitation in his eyes, the same weakness Jae-won had taught her to look for. I'm not the woman you think I am, Zuri whispered. I'm the woman who survived the streets of Seoul with nothing. And I'm the woman who is going to take that boy home. In one fluid motion, she didn't grab the gun, she grabbed his wrist, using his own momentum to slam him against the steel railing. She delivered a sharp, brutal strike to his throat, a move she had seen Jae-won practice 100 times. As the guard collapsed, gasping for air, Zuri snatched the detonator and the pistol. Below, Jae-won had reached Seo-jun, shielding the boy's eyes with his coat as he neutralized the last of the mercenaries. He looked up, his face splattered with blood and his eyes burning with a dark, primal light. He saw Zuri standing at the railing, the traitor at her feet, looking down at them like a guardian angel forged in fire. For a moment, the world stood still. There was no boss, no waitress, and no contract, only a family that had fought its way back from the edge of the abyss. The adrenaline of the dockyards had faded into a deep, hollow exhaustion. Back at the estate, the silence felt different, no longer cold and oppressive, but fragile, like glass that had been shattered and painstakingly glued back together. Seo-jun was finally asleep in his own bed, his small hand tucked under his pillow, safe within the fortress they had bled to protect. Zuri found Jae-won in the private tea room, the sliding doors open to the midnight garden. He was shirtless, hunched over as he cleaned a fresh cut on his forearm. The harsh moonlight caught the intricate ink on his back, and for the first time, Zuri saw the dragon in its entirety. It wasn't just a symbol of power or a mark of the syndicate. As she moved closer, she realized the dragon's tail coiled around a delicate, hidden image near his heart, a single, perfectly rendered plum blossom, the traditional Korean symbol of resilience and spring. My mother loved those flowers, Jae-won said without turning around, his voice a low, rough shadow of its usual command. She used to say that the plum blossom is the only flower that dares to bloom while the snow is still on the ground. It doesn't wait for permission to be beautiful. It just is. Zuri sat beside him, taking the antiseptic from his hands. As she worked, she noticed small, faint characters woven into the dragon's scales, a poem of mourning and a promise of protection. She was the one the red light was for, Jae-won whispered, his gaze fixed on the dark trees outside. The syndicate wanted my father to marry for power, just like the elders wanted for me. When he chose her, a woman of no standing, they decided to show him the cost of his sentiment. I spent 20 years turning myself into a monster so that no one would ever dare touch what was mine again. I thought if I became the dragon, I could protect the flower. He turned to her then, and Zuri saw the moisture in his eyes that he would never allow the world to see. But I realized tonight, watching you in that warehouse. I didn't just bring you here to protect Seo-jun. I brought you here because I was freezing to death in my own winter. I've spent my whole life waiting for the snow to melt. Zuri reached out, her thumb gently tracing the plum blossom nestled against his ribs. She realized then that his heart wasn't made of stone, it was made of scars and a desperate, hidden tenderness that had been waiting for someone brave enough to see it. He wasn't a monster who happened to love a child, he was a man who had built a cage of violence to keep one small piece of beauty alive. The snow is gone, Jae-won, she whispered, leaning in until her forehead rested against his. You don't have to be the monster anymore. You just have to be his father. And you just have to be mine. The morning air was crisp and carried the faint scent of rain-washed pine. For the first time since Zuri had arrived at the estate, the heavy presence of the black-suited guards was absent. Jae-won had dismissed them all to the outer perimeter, creating a rare, silent pocket of peace in the center of the fortress. He stood on the stone bridge overlooking the koi pond, dressed not in his armor of tailored silk, but in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked younger, stripped of the dragon's terrifying mantle, yet more formidable in his honesty. Zuri walked toward him, her footsteps light on the gravel. In her hand, she carried the leather folder, the contract that had dictated every breath she took for months. Without a word, she held it out to him. It's been 6 months, she said softly. The debt is paid. The visa is secured. According to this, I'm free to go. Jae-won didn't look at the folder. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers with a raw intensity that made the fake wedding ring on her finger feel heavy. He took the folder from her, but he didn't open it. Instead, he walked over to a small stone brazier used for garden clippings and dropped the document inside. He struck a match, and they watched in silence as the legal terms and financial settlements curled into black ash. The contract was a coward's way of keeping you near me, Jae-won said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant vibration. He stepped closer, stepping out of the shadows and into the light. I told myself I needed you for Seo-jun. I told the elders I needed you for the family's stability. But the truth is much simpler, and much more dangerous. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, a detail he would have never allowed anyone else to see, as he cupped her cheek. There were no bodyguards to witness this, no elders to appease, and no monsters to fight. It was just a man and a woman in the quiet of a garden. I am a man who has lived in the dark for a long time, Zuri. I've forgotten how to want things for myself. But when I think of a life without you, the silence is unbearable. He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath hitching. I'm not asking you to stay as a mother. I'm not asking you to stay as a shield. I'm asking you to stay because I love you. Stay for me. Not because you have to, but because you want to be the one who stands beside me when the world tries to take the light away. Zuri looked into the eyes of the man who had been her captor, her teacher, and her protector. The waitress who had been hiding behind a counter was gone, in her place stood a woman who finally knew where she belonged. She didn't need a signature or a settlement. She reached up, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of salt, smoke, and a future they would build on their own terms. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, drifting like pink snow over the courtyard of the Shin estate. This time, the gates weren't closed to keep the world out, but thrown open to welcome a new era. The wedding was unlike anything the Seoul underworld had ever witnessed. There were no rigid mafia protocols or cold, transactional alliances. Instead, the air was filled with the soulful sounds of a gospel choir blending with the elegant notes of a traditional Korean gyeojeum. Zuri stood at the end of the aisle, a vision of strength and beauty in a gown that was a masterpiece of both worlds, ivory silk embroidered with the vibrant, bold patterns of her heritage and the delicate plum blossoms of his. As she walked toward Jae-won, she didn't see the feared boss of a syndicate or the dragon, who commanded a city. She saw the man who had burned every contract for her. Beside him stood Seo-jun, dressed in a tiny black suit, his face beaming with a joy so bright it seemed to heal every shadow in the garden. The elders sat in the front row, their expressions no longer filled with disdain, but with a quiet, stunned realization. They watched as Zuri's foster family from America sat alongside the household staff and the high-ranking members of the family, sharing food and laughter. The purity they had obsessed over had been replaced by something far more resilient, a chosen unity. When it came time for the vows, there were no legalistic promises. Jae-won took Zuri's hands in his thumbs tracing the skin he had once kept at a distance. "You didn't just join my family, Zuri," he whispered, his voice steady and clear for everyone to hear. "You saved it. You taught a monster how to be a man, and a king how to be a father." Zuri smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears that were no longer born of fear. "We didn't find each other in the light, Jae-won. We found each other in the dark and decided to stay there until it wasn't dark anymore." As they were declared husband and wife, a roar of applause erupted, but the loudest cheer came from the small boy jumping up and down between them. Seo-jun grabbed both of their hands, pulling them down so he could whisper between them. "I told you, Miss Zuri," he said, his voice full of childish triumph. "I told you my daddy was the best." Zuri looked at the man she loved and the son she had fought for. The waitress from the diner and the mafia boss from the shadows had vanished, leaving behind a family built not on blood or crime, but on a single, playful proposal made in a kitchen. As the sun set over the estate, the legacy of the dragon was no longer one of fear, it was one of love, and for the first time in his life, Shin Jae-won was finally home. If you loved seeing the dragon finally meet his match, hit that like button and subscribe. What would you do if a child made you a life-changing offer in a dark kitchen? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.